So we have been covering these minimal facts, which are accepted by nearly all scholars who study the subject of ancient Christianity. And we're making sure that as we're going through this to only utilize evidence which is considered strongly evidenced. As a reminder, this is our criteria for what's considered strongly evidenced, that it meets some of these, not always all of them, but it meets at least some of these, that it be multiply and independently attested by different sources, that it's attested by an enemy. We talked pretty extensively last week about the testimony of Paul and James, who were either enemies or skeptics of Jesus. We take into account if it's an embarrassing admission. We'll talk more about that today, so I won't dwell on it. Valuing eyewitness testimony and early testimony as well. Now, these are the criteria that we use to then get into the minimal facts that we've covered so far. That Jesus died by crucifixion, that the disciples believed that they had seen the risen Christ, and that the strong skeptics of James and Paul were converted by what they claim to be an appearance of the resurrected Jesus. The book that we have been using as a way for us to get a lot of our historical background and information has been The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Habermas. The authors of that book say that these facts are actually sufficient to narrow down all the potential explanations to really just one that accounts for all of these facts, that Jesus was literally raised from the dead. Now, today we're going to look at one more line of evidence, the empty tomb. Now, to be very transparent, with my big fat asterisk up there that leads us down here, this can't be considered one of our minimal facts because it's not as universally held as the other three that we just looked at, which means that it's not almost every scholar that holds it. It's about 75% of people who study in this field agree to the empty tomb. Now, that is not so much an indictment that the empty tomb is not historically strong and worth talking about and exploring, but it's really a testament to how strong those other three facts are if 75% is considered the weak one. I passed calculus in high school on a 75%. Don't start telling me that's not a good enough percentage now. 75 is still really strong in historical circles. Now, we want to have the strongest case, which is why we focused on those first three facts the way that we did. However, the resurrection is the empty tomb specifically is very much worth investigating and looking into, particularly because of the ramifications of it, right? If the tomb is empty, what does that then mean? As we go into studying the empty tomb together, there's three basic building blocks that we look at to build our case for the empty tomb. Call it the Jerusalem factor, enemy attestation, and then the testimony of women. If you need a little acronym to help you remember this in the future, just think JET. Jerusalem, enemy, testimony. Okay, any questions before we jump into what is the Jerusalem factor? Okay, very good. Huh? Sort of. So.
What word did you say? Factor?
Factor. Yes, Jerusalem factor. So, the Jerusalem factor is that in Jerusalem, Jesus was publicly executed. He was also alleged to have been seen alive after this execution. And it's where he was proclaimed to be the risen Messiah by the disciples. All these things happened within 50 days in Jerusalem. And so let's look quickly. We're going to see how we get through the rest of this. See if I can stumble my way through. Let's look quickly at the scriptural basis and some of the non-scriptural basis we have here for these factors. That he was publicly executed. Then the whole company of them arose and brought them before Pilate. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. So we have this record. I just picked a small verse for us to look at for us. Obviously, you can read the whole thing and see Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion all happen in and around Jerusalem. Technically, Golgotha is right outside of Jerusalem because when you're going to have someone that is this heinous be killed in this way of crucifixion, you take them outside of the city gates to do that. But it's all happening in and around Jerusalem. And we have both Pilate and Herod present in Jerusalem at this time to tie it all together as significant in this moment, in this location. We've read this quote before, but I wanted to bring it back out. This is from Tacitus. It says, Christus, from whom the name for Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, which is Tacitus's reference and way he refers to crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. So we have historical and biblical record that Jesus' death is in Jerusalem. Next, he's allegedly seen alive again. Obviously, we've looked at it pretty extensively from the perspective of the disciples and from Paul and from James. I wanted to show us one that we had not talked about as much. This is the two believers on the road to Emmaus. It's from the book of Luke. It says, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. So again, we're outside of Jerusalem here. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. This is after it was revealed to them by Jesus. Hey, it's me, Jesus. And they rose that same hour and they returned to Jerusalem. So about 7 miles out, they're close enough to where this is in the Jerusalem area. And they turned back around from whatever they were doing, going to Emmaus, to head back to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 disciples and those who were with them gathered together, saying, the Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. And as they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said, peace to you. So there's Jesus appearing again to the disciples and to other believers who are not part of the 12 in and around Jerusalem, and then boom, right at the end of our story, he pops back in Jerusalem to be like, hey, it's me again, peace to you. And then we have that he's proclaimed alive by his disciples here in Acts chapter 2. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. Peter lifted up his voice, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men, God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death. So what we have here is you see that it's in Jerusalem that the disciples on Pentecost start proclaiming Jesus' resurrection as well. So why is it significant to highlight Jerusalem as the epicenter for all of this activity from a historical perspective? Well, because if Jesus' body is still cold in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the enemies of Jesus would have just been like, well, if you want to see the dead Jesus and figure out how dumb it is that all these people are saying he's been resurrected, let's just pop on over to the tomb real quick, exhume the body, and I will show you your dead Savior right here. If the tomb is not empty, none of this makes any sense because it's so easily disproven by the enemies of Jesus. There is no record of this occurring, or even attempting for this to occur, despite how much it would have strengthened the early opponents of Jesus and of Christianity and of the resurrection in particular. There's a guy by the name of Celsus, who is a very early vocal opponent in the 2nd century of Christianity, who wrote extensively against the resurrection. And he never references that they tried to go to the tomb to produce the body of Jesus. And that would have obviously been quite literally the nail in the coffin in his argument there. Christianity would not have been able to take off in the way that it did if his body was in the tomb. So if we're just looking for arguments of why the tomb would be empty, this is great support of that it all happened in and around the same place so quickly after. Now I mentioned it's about 50 days between Passover and Pentecost. And it's really easy to look at the early church calendar to get that worked out. So one of the arguments against this Jerusalem factor is, well, of course they didn't produce the body because 50 days in the tomb, he would have been decayed beyond recognition. It wouldn't have been helpful to produce a body, right? Well, that's pretty strongly disagreed to by the medical examiner's office for the Commonwealth of Virginia. It says, even in Virginia's warm and damp climate, an unprepared corpse should still have the hair and stature, and the wounds would definitely be identifiable even after 50 days. Jerusalem, as you probably know, is a far more arid climate than Virginia, which would have resulted in a slower decomposition. We also have biblical record that the body was prepared. And so that would also preserve the body for longer as well. So scientifically, this explanation of the 50 days is not a valid reason to say why the body would not have been produced. And frankly, even if it was pretty decayed, I think if I was the Romans or the Jews, I probably would have still tried. I'd probably still, even if you're like, hey, you might not recognize this guy, but this is Jesus's body. We found it over there in the tomb. I think even if it didn't convince everybody, you're telling me you just started believing the resurrection of Jesus 48 hours ago, and they produce a body for you that they say is the body of Jesus, that might not cause you to have a second guess if you're not 100% bought in yet. It's definitely worth them trying to produce that. The fact that they didn't is a pretty strong check mark in the column of that there really was an empty tomb. Okay, any questions about that or comments before we move into enemy attestation?
Why wouldn't the Roman soldiers ever guard the tomb prove that the body was still there?
Right, absolutely. We were on duty, standing right there. So, yeah. So, absolutely. I think all of this is good evidence as to why the tomb was likely empty. Let's look here at another line of evidence for the empty tomb. Enemy attestation. So, as we talked about, one of the ways that we value historical accounts is when an opponent, when someone who's against this view says something that would actually support it. Now, the earliest accusations, all the way back into the Bible here in Matthew 28, were that the disciples stole the body, right? Which implies that the tomb must have been empty, right? If we're making an accusation, the disciples stole the body, that must mean there's no body in that tomb, right? When the kid says the dog ate my homework, they're saying, well, I don't have the homework. You would come up, I talked about being a liar earlier, you'd come up with a different lie. But if this is the explanation you come up with, it's likely that the body is truly not in the tomb. So when Matthew chapter 28, when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to those soldiers who were guarding the tomb and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Which is also comical when you think about how large the stone would have been and how loud it would have been to have to move the stone and all of those things. But you start the story and the cover-up, right? So this is why it was really broadly spread. Justin Martyr is a very early apologist, someone who defends the Christian faith. He is writing in defense of Christianity, in defense of the resurrection here when he says this. Yet you not only have not repented after you learned that he rose from the dead, but as I said before, You've sent chosen and ordained men throughout all the world to proclaim that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. So this is a little confusing. Go with me here. Okay, so this is Justin Martyr, who's defending the faith, explaining what those against Christianity are claiming. So he's saying, here's the things that you've done and said against the resurrection. And he lays out for us what we've already said, which is that he's saying that the disciples stole him from the night in the tomb. So because of these two plans of stealing the body, or explanations, not plans, alleged plans, and that the body was stolen, what we have here is an admission that the body is not there in the tomb. Now, we've talked already pretty extensively about why stealing the body doesn't make sense of all of the evidence that we have available to us. One of our minimal facts, well, I guess I'll let you guys do this. Which of our minimal facts is not sufficiently accounted for by the disciples stealing the body of Jesus?
Roman discipline.
Yes, the fact that that would have been almost impossible with the fact that the Romans are there.
Well, and somebody saying that they could tell whoever their leader was at that point in time that we were asleep when they stole the body. When we were asleep. Yeah, right.
Right.
Take that.
Death sentence. Death sentence.
Asleep on watch was an instant death penalty.
Right. Right.
And still is.
So let me take us back to our three minimal facts that we've been using. That Jesus was crucified, that the disciples believed they saw the resurrected Jesus, and that skeptics Paul and James saw he was resurrected. Which of those three, or one or more of those facts, is not accounted for by if it was the disciples who stole the body?
The disciples believed that they saw the risen.
Right, because if the disciples went in and they stole the body, they would not be convinced that Jesus was really raised from the dead. In fact, they'd be quite convinced to the contrary. Jesus super did not raise from the dead. We know because we hid the body. It's a really obvious explanation, or hole in the explanation, to say, well, we've already looked extensively at the disciples had to genuinely believe that he was raised from the dead, because they claimed that he was, and they were willing to hold that claim to the point of death. Nobody dies for what they know to be a lie. So we can take this potential explanation and say it's not sufficient for our minimal facts. Even if it tries to explain why there'd be an empty tomb, it does not explain the disciples, or, by the way, why James and Paul would be convinced otherwise. They needed to have an appearance from the risen Jesus himself in order to be convinced to do a 180-degree turnaround. So, our minimal facts hold fast against that explanation. Okay, let's go into the testimony of women. Now, this has been, you've probably heard this before, but the testimony of women in the first century in both Jewish and Roman cultures was held to a lesser degree than the testimony of a man. We'll look at a couple of quotes here in a second. But first, I wanted us to establish that it was women who were the first ones to find the empty tomb. And then they're the ones who appear in all four of the Gospels as seeing the empty tomb. Only in two of the Gospels do we have the account of the disciples, the men, going to see this as well. So now I think I already read part of this, but now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. That's the Matthew 28 version. It also appears in Mark 16, Luke 24, and John 20. But it's only in John 24 and John 20 that we also see that they go and get the disciples and the men come back and see this as well. Remember when we talked about embarrassing admissions as one of the criteria for strong historical evidence? If you were fabricating a story as the disciples about your risen Savior, and you're saying, okay, we're going to have to invent this religion real quick and start telling stories around it and all that stuff to keep ourselves in power and in control and all that stuff. Your story does not start with, well, the women went first while we were hiding out and the women went to go see it and they found the empty tomb. And when they came to tell us, we were a little bit about it, because this is the sentiment, according to Jews, about the testimony of women. From the Talmud, sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women. The world cannot exist without males and without females. Happy is he whose children are males, and woe to him whose children are females. From Josephus, Jewish historian from the 1st and 2nd century. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable that they may not speak the truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. Now, it's easy to understand his claims about the servant. It is a generalized statement that is really devaluing of people who are enslaved. We should not endorse that, but at least he gives a reason, right, of saying, well, they're trying to either get themselves out of a bad situation or protect themselves or whatever. But he says the testimony of the woman is as good as the testimony of a slave. And we all know the testimony of a slave is terrible. And so it's like, whoa, okay. Down here again in the Talmud, which is, I didn't clarify, the Talmud is the writings of the rabbis and the Pharisees, like the teachers of the day in the Jewish faith. Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer, although they are not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber, meaning someone who's been convicted by a rabbi as a robber, it's equivalent to saying that one who's rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. Not only is the testimony of a woman only as good as a slave, it's also only as good as a thief. So you wouldn't trust the testimony of a thief, right? So why would you trust the testimony of a woman? Remember who the disciples were. Jews. They were following Jesus. They are Jews. This is the culture of the day, and they're about to go stand up in front of quite literally God and everyone on Pentecost, standing on the testimony that was first given by women. And they're writing down in their records, as they're writing down the gospel, the women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb. But not only is the Jewish view of the testimony of women low, the Roman view culturally, the testimony of women is low. So this is from Roman historian Suetonius. He's writing in 115, but he's writing like a biography of Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar of Rome during the birth of Jesus. So this is during the correct time of the resurrection of Christ. Whereas men and women had hitherto always sat together, Augustus confined women to the back rows, even at gladiatorial shows. The only ones exempt from this rule being the Vestal virgins, for whom separate accommodation was provided facing the praetor's tribunal. No women at all were allowed to witness the athletic contests. Indeed, when the audience clamored at the games for a special boxing match to celebrate his appointment as chief priest, Augustus postponed this until early the next morning and issued a proclamation to the effect that it was the chief priest's desire that women should not attend the theater before 10 o'clock. So he said, we're going to do this. We don't even want any of the women to be there because we don't value them seeing this, being a part of this. The value of women in this society was unbelievably low. So it's embarrassing for the disciples to admit in this culture and at this time that women found the tomb first. And secondarily, that the disciples doubted this. It does help us make sense of this a little bit. Luke 24, but these words of the women when they came back from the tomb seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Why did they not believe them? Because they were Jews living in the Roman Empire. Of course they didn't believe the testimony of the women. The disciples were doubting that the tomb is empty based on the testimony of these women. It makes it highly unlikely that the gospel authors would invent a story in which the primary witnesses are those who would not be believed by almost anyone. And it makes the disciples themselves look bad. When you're inventing a story, you very rarely invent a story to make yourself look bad. It rings of the truth when this is at the center of it. So, that's our three streams of evidence. The Jerusalem factor, enemy attestation, testimony of women. Again, these evidences that we lay out are meant to show that the tomb was in fact empty as one of our pieces of evidence that we could use to defend the resurrection. Is the resurrection of Jesus actually the best explanation of our facts? So we've got our three minimal facts and we've got our extra one down there. If we're going to claim a supernatural explanation for what happened 3 days after Passover started, we ought to first rule out all of the naturalistic explanations. And that might seem like an unfair bias against religious claims or supernatural claims. But if you just think for a second, it's the same thing that we would do for a miracle claim from a different religion. It's the same scrutiny that I would put towards an Islamic claim of the miraculous, to a Mormon's claim, to a Jewish claim, whatever. I would approach it of, well, can we explain it naturally first before I buy in on the supernatural side of this? So I think it's only fair that we apply that same standard to ourselves as Christians and our claims about the resurrection. Now, where this becomes a problem is that there is no naturalistic explanation of the facts. When there is no naturalistic explanations of the facts, and we have seriously religious implications of what happens here, then we ought to be open to the supernatural in order to remain unbiased. So what we're going to do now as an activity together is we're going to play rapid fire refutation. I thought that sounded good to say together, so I used refutation. I'm going to play the part of a skeptic. I'm going to present to you guys several different naturalistic explanations for what may have happened that was not the resurrection. And what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to use these minimal facts to point out, just like we did earlier, which one or two or three of these minimal facts include the empty tomb in this as well for our conversation here. Which of these is not satisfied by my explanation? Okay, start with that. I know you guys have all sorts of other great reasons for why those things don't work. Stick to the minimal facts because these are the ones we know are historically strong and convincing to someone who might hold the naturalistic worldview. Any questions before we get started about what we're doing?
Are you still shouting it out?
Yeah, let's work together as a room on this. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, let's do it. Okay, so the resurrection account of Jesus that we see in the Gospels looks exactly like several of the other resurrection legends and myths that we see have developed in a wide variety of other places and times and And so we should not view the Gospels as a historical work. We should be viewing the Gospels as a non-historical, legendary literary genre. That is why it has all of these components in it. Because it makes for a good story for us to enjoy about a great man in history, Jesus.
That's all wrong.
There it is.
You got it. No. Okay. So,
1, 2, 3, 4.
all right. Give me something. Give me something.
Well, the documentation of Jesus being crucified, so he did die.
That's historical record outside.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's very good. Okay. But that only establishes that he died, right? I didn't disagree that Jesus died. I disagreed that the things that were said thereafter.
Where's the empty tomb for all these other guys?
Yeah. Sorry. Can you say that again?
Where is the empty tomb for all these other guys?
And that's combining crucifixion with the empty tomb, I think is the fastest way to respond to this and the cleanest way, because you say, look, you've got historical record that Jesus was indeed crucified, and then you've got the Jerusalem factor, right? So the reason this couldn't have been a legend and a myth is because legends and mythologies develop over hundreds of years, not over 50 years. There's people still alive. You can't tell a legend about somebody when they're like, no, I was there. Like, if you're talking about that amazing moment in your high school football game when we were down by 6 and it was the last minute and all that, and I made an unbelievable one-finger catch in the end zone and all that. I can't go telling that to people I went to high school with, because they're like, yeah, I was there. You were on the bench, like that. You can't tell a legend to people who were there. Right, exactly. So yes, very good.
And space in order to create a legend.
Absolutely. Time and space are important to the formation of legend. Not to mention, when you're talking genre, the genre of the Gospels is much closer to ancient biography, similar to the biographies that were writing about other great men at the time, like the Caesars, for example. Their biographical accounts read much more like the Gospels than other myths and legends and those sorts of things. Very good. Okay, let's do another one. Okay, so I know we talked about that the disciples couldn't be the ones to have moved the body because they really believed it. But someone else came in and moved the body. Maybe it was Joseph of Arimathea came in. It was his tomb after all. And he moves the body, which is why you have an empty tomb, which is why the disciples are convinced that he's really been raised because the tomb is empty. It wasn't the disciples who did it. Somebody else moved the body.
The problem is Paul.
How so?
So then the problem is Paul and James, because Paul wouldn't have been convinced by an empty tomb because he didn't care. He knew that there was supposedly an empty tomb and was pursuing to kill Christians, and then had an encounter where he was changed.
Right. An empty tomb is totally unconvincing to Paul. Because, again, he is Mr. Super Jew himself, as he calls. He says, I was rising among all the Jews among me. So that he knew the party line. Disciples moved the body, right? Empty tomb didn't faze him one bit. It invigorated him to go and hunt down and kill Christians. So the fact, whether it was the disciples or someone else, he doesn't care about that. Something else had to happen to him. Also, what are the disciples claiming? Are they claiming there's an empty tomb, therefore our Savior lives? Yes, they claim to have actually seen Jesus himself. So while this explanation might account for part of the disciples' belief, it does not account for their claims.
So we know they saw him walk through walls. They walked on the water afterwards. Is there any other thing out there showing that he performed a miracle other than those two things? I mean, he was there for another 50 days teaching. Is there any other thing that he did as far as miracles go besides?
Like, is there other historical account of Jesus' miracles? Not that would be considered historically significant. The Gospels are historically significant, and those portions are. But other people's writings would be considered less so because we can't be certain about the authorship of all of these different letters and stuff floating around at the time. But thankfully, what we have is sufficient for us to hold this case.
So no, there's not any record in the Bible about other miracles.
Just those two.
Oh, those are the two that I can think of off the. I mean, he wasn't walking on water after he was resurrected, but he was on the shore, and he tells them to throw their nets on the other side, and they catch buku bucks of fish and that sort of thing. So we do have that. The appearance on the road to Emmaus, he kind of just poofs in. There's also when he appears as in the garden, in the
nail.
the fact he's walking around with holes in him as well. Yes, absolutely. So it kind of depends on where you define the line of miracle. There's lots of appearances and records of those appearances within the Bible. Okay, let's do another one. This one's one of my favorite. The tomb wasn't empty. This went to the wrong tomb. It's, those ancient Israelites had a hard time with record keeping. And so this was, I'm being a little unfair and tongue-in-cheek, but maybe they got something crisscrossed, or Joseph of Arimathea lied about which spot or whatever. They went to the wrong tomb, and that one is empty. Jesus' body was in another tomb.
Yeah, but Roman soldiers wouldn't have been put on the wrong one.
Yeah, but remember, focus on our things here too. The ones that are our strongest evidences.
They still believe that they saw him.
Yeah, he saw him.
Yeah, it's still 2 and 3.
He appeared to people.
Right. Exactly. It comes back really similarly to the moving the body around and all that stuff. The claim is not based on only the empty tomb. The claim is that Jesus appeared to me resurrected, which brings up, it's not just the disciples who believe, but Paul who also believes, and James who also believes. And so just explanations for the empty tomb is not going to be enough here, which will also, this one will have the same explanations to it, but it was too good not to share. So John Dominic Crossan is very famous in these circles as being anti-resurrection. He's an accomplished author and speaker and all those things. His explanation for the empty tomb is that Jesus was never actually put in a tomb, but because he was crucified, what was typical of the time is he's buried in a common grave. So where they put all of the criminals together. The other 2 thieves on the cross, they all get thrown in a common grave together. And the reason that you couldn't produce the body is because the wild dogs came and ate Jesus's body. And so there was nothing to show, which is why they wouldn't exhume the body. I'm like, first of all, gross. Second of all, there's so many things to point to as to why that doesn't work. It does not match the record that we have. You have craft, it's called ad hoc, but it's when you craft a solution in an explanation that's so unlikely but fits your problem. It's not the best solution it's not the best answer to the problem in front of you, the best explanation of what happened. It's just because I can't take this one, I can piecemeal together enough of an explanation to why there was an empty tomb, and this is my explanation. It doesn't account for our other facts, though, for the appearance and the claims of the appearances of Jesus. Okay, let's move into a slightly different direction. Okay. Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He just mostly died. He was most of the way to dead. He fainted on the cross, went comatose even, if you will. And yeah, apparently it's just a Princess Bride kind of day. I don't know. And so they took the body and they put him in the tomb. And after a few days in the coolness of the tomb, Jesus is revived. And he gets up and he walks out and he goes and he finds his disciples. And they take this to be the resurrected Jesus, but it was actually the never dead, almost dead, mostly dead Jesus.
That's a big rock to move. Like
Them bones healed though, didn't they?
no food
From
or water
inside
for
the
3
tomb.
days.
Also, the stabbing of the on the side.
Very
legs-
good.
The legs are always broken with a crucifix.
Just the fact that he was crucified, we're not gonna outsmart the Romans. We're not gonna burn Jerusalem on that one.
Right.
They're really good at killing people.
Yeah.
You guys have pieced together the most important parts.
Sticking the sword in his side was kind of a definite.
Correct. So you guys have honed in on the right part to start, which is crucifixion. So if this is an attempt to explain the empty tomb, of course, but it also is an attempt to explain why this resurrected Jesus keeps showing up to people, the one to go to is crucifixion. I heard both Jasper and Mark say that Roman centurion stabbed him in the side with a spear. Instead of, which was the typical method, breaking the legs, which would ensure suffocation and death, he said, well, he looks pretty dead. Let's poke him with a stick and find out. And was very dead. The crucifixion, it doesn't take a lot of digging and research into history to know that the Romans were exceptional at killing people and making sure that they stayed dead. And so just by looking at the fact that Jesus was crucified means there is no way that he just swooned and then was revived later. And also, like you pointed out, these are not conducive conditions to recovering from a near-death experience. No food, no water, lying in a cave. It's probably not the way to go.
You don't move the stone.
Exactly. Is there this secret back entrance that you go in? I don't know. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. Okay, we'll just do one or two more here. We're almost to the end. We've seen these delusional cult leaders throughout history who are as dedicated to their beliefs as anyone and willing to die for their beliefs. We've seen it in Houston, drinking the Kool-Aid, all the different compounds and people where they go unto the point of death to die for what they believe in. And the leader is charismatic enough and convinced enough to bring other people alongside them into this belief. It doesn't make it true. And that's what we have here in the story of the resurrection, is that we have the charismatic leader of Peter, who is so convincing that he has rallied a new religion upstart here in Jerusalem.
Those leaders didn't die first.
Yeah, right? Okay, so that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it's illogical, and also, if we want to take all the people out of the equation, Jesus died and the tomb was empty.
right.
That's the thing.
Okay, died
Yes.
and put in the tomb and then raised from the dead.
Exactly. So if Jesus is crucified, that part we can at least acknowledge within this cult leader theory. The empty tomb gets really difficult. You'd probably have to take this theory plus some other theory that explains the empty tomb, which we've already have shown how those things don't work. But I think
Peter's very impulsive and not
yeah,
a convincing leader prior to Jesus' death.
yeah.
I mean, he denied him.
Right. This is a really bad charismatic leader.
Yeah.
It's just from a profile perspective.
Get everybody to agree that, hey, I'm going to run this thing.
Yeah.
After he denied him and ran away and everything else, I
Right.
don't see anybody really wanting to follow him
Absolutely.
after that.
I still think you guys have not hit on probably the most significant one. The most significant factor as to why the charismatic cult leader doesn't work is that in order for a cult leader to be successful, they're only successful with people who are open to the suggestion. You know, people who can be convinced and won over. That ain't Paul.
James wasn't one of them.
James is not likely one of them. James is like, look, I know Jesus a lot better than you. We shared a bathroom growing up, you know? and then you've got Paul, who is, we looked at last week, has said, I was convinced that bad things needed to be done to the Christians to stop this from spreading. He was not open to the suggestion of a charismatic cult leader. It doesn't work. Paul is just as charismatic as anybody. He is just as much a leader in the church after the fact as Peter. I mean, he is not open to suggestion here. He's open to a radical encounter with the raised Christ, which is, again, what he claims. And there is so little to gain as well in this. Okay. We'll do one last one because we haven't gotten to do one in this way. So what we have with Paul, because Paul seems to be breaking a lot of our illustrations here and our explanations here. I'll give you one that's very Paul specific. Paul had an aneurysm in the desert. So, sorry, I'm going to try to contain myself. What we have here is not an appearance of the resurrected Jesus to Paul. What we have here is Paul, who's under a lot of stress, who has been pushing himself to the physical and emotional limits of hunting down these Christians and bringing them in. He has a psychotic break. And all of a sudden, he's seeing things that aren't there. The other two guys who are standing with them, even in the book of Acts, it says they don't see anything there. It's something that happens in Paul's mind and can be explained by modern neuroscience and is not the resurrected Lord.
Except they heard.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just pretend I don't care about the book of Acts for a second. How else could you respond to that? Yeah, the disciples believed before Paul. James clearly believes independent of Paul, because Paul doesn't meet James until after he's a believer, when he goes to the church in Jerusalem. I think you're starting to see the theme here, is that when you build up these minimal facts, and I hope you noticed all of these you could have explained without the empty tomb as well. The empty tomb is helpful, but all of those had another explanation outside of the empty tomb. With these minimal facts, what you start to see is there's no way that any one of these explanations can be sufficient to provide an explanation for these facts of the case. Now, could you combine some of these together and, say, well, I'm going to take one of these explanations that we're going to take the swoon theory that Jesus wasn't actually dead and that Paul had an aneurysm in the desert, and whatever. Take whatever combination of these things that you want, and I'm going to be able to check all my boxes off. Well, that doesn't work for two reasons. One, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This doesn't increase the probability and the likelihood that your explanation is good. If you're saying, well, there's an 80%, even if we're being generous, there's an 80% chance that someone moved the body. And there's an 80% chance that, that James and Paul were convinced by charismatic leader Peter. And there's an 80%, you just keep going down, you add these things together, your percentage likelihood is decreasing each time you add one of those things. We're looking for the best explanation of the facts, not a potential explanation. The resurrection cleanly and easily explains all of these. Jesus died on the cross. He was really dead. You have to be dead in order to be not dead anymore. How do you explain that the disciples believed they saw the risen Christ? Easy, because Jesus was raised from the dead and he showed up to them. What about Paul and James? What would it take for them to believe? I don't know. Maybe Jesus being raised from the dead and showing up and saying, hey, it's me, Jesus. I did what I said I was going to do. And why would the tomb be empty? Because Jesus got up and he walked out of it alive. It's a very easy explanation for this.
You'd have had a tough time if it wasn't for that angel sitting on a rock.
I think so. It's a good thing he's got all of the help he needs and then some. Now, the empty tomb on its own as a standalone fact means almost nothing. Just in the same way that the crucifixion on its own as a fact means almost nothing. It's easy to explain the tomb on its own. As we saw, there's several different potential explanations on there. However, if the tomb is empty because Jesus was resurrected from the dead, then it becomes the most important fact in history. Because it would indicate that God exists, that eternal life is possible and that eternal life is available to us, just like Jesus claimed. Because remember, Jesus himself said, I'm going to give you the sign of Jonah. Dead for 3 days, raised. The empty tomb is the testament that Jesus is exactly who he said he is. Because the tomb is empty, because Jesus was resurrected and not for any other reason, that's why we celebrate Easter. That's what today is about. The hope that comes from life springing up out of the mouth of death. A tomb is meant to be the last place someone goes. It's meant to be where hope goes literally to die. And instead, it's the place that our hope was born eternal. Praise God for that. May we live like he is risen, because he is risen indeed.